Hey, Sandy. That's the only reason people take my class is because I don't have to.
Well, we like Bill Beck.
What's that?
We like to pick on Bill Beck.
Exactly. Oh, yeah.
That picture of you two that got posted. Oh, have you seen the other one that got posted?
Oh, is there another one? Oh. Did you see the video?
Not the video.
Oh, dude, you should see the video. The promo they did. Because they have them do this, and then he goes. So when the explosion goes away, he's still standing there doing it.
I love Bill Beck.
We had a lot of fun. Laura Burke was the one that was doing it.
Oh, really?
She had to tell me 3 or 4 times. She had to tell us, would you guys please stop fighting? We gotta get through the night. What are you doing?
Hey,
Packing them in.
yeah, small room.
Bill Beck's so funny. I really like Bill Beck.
You're not that popular. He is awesome.
Somebody's got to get picked on in the Valentine's Day. Might as well be him.
Oh, it's both of us. No, it's definitely. It's great to meet you guys. Good to see you. Yeah. I really thought you were.
It's like being in your old classics. You know? Get your notebook out. That's right.
two or three open seats, one there, one back there, one here. So if you don't want to stand, you don't have to. There's a few seats. Well, thanks for being here today. Thanks for your interest in this topic. I guess I can begin by rhetorical criticism. And what we're going to talk about today is kind of one of the latest fads in New Testament scholarship. That doesn't mean that it's useless. These things kind of disappear after a while. But it is the kind of big thing right now in biblical studies. And I do want to present this topic for a couple reasons. First of all, it has to do with our theme of the gospel and what the gospel is and what it sounds like in the ancient world. But also because there is an aspect of this particular theme or trend in New Testament studies that I find kind of disturbing. And so I think especially younger students of the discipline are going to find themselves exposed more and more to this. And I just wanted to say a few things about this and where I stand on it, and hopefully it will be helpful to you. So there is a set of terminology. There's terminology and a set of concepts. Can I get my clicker to work here? Maybe not. Here we go. The idea begins with just simply noticing the dominance of Roman imperial ideology and propaganda in the ancient world, especially as it was portrayed in public texts. Some of you have traveled to biblical sites, and if you have gone to places like Ephesus or Caesarea Maritima there in Israel, you can't help but notice the ruins of the Roman architecture with Latin inscriptions on them. And especially if you go to a place like Caesarea, that's in Palestine, that's in Jewish territory. And it's kind of interesting when you find Latin inscriptions in a place like that. Did the Romans think that everybody knew Latin? And the answer is no. They knew that a lot of people couldn't read those inscriptions, but that was kind of the point. It was the Romans coming in and saying, we are in charge, this is the language that we speak, and if you don't speak this language, you need to get on board with what we're doing. So it kind of made you feel like an outsider. It was one of their tactics, but that's pretty much everywhere in the ancient world. Where there is a Roman presence, there are these public texts, and of course there are Roman officials. Depending on where you are in the Roman Empire, there might be legions stationed at places. And in some places this is more obvious than others. In some places the locals are more on board with it than others. But it is throughout the ancient world. This is one of the things that the Romans were really good at, is portraying the image that they wanted everybody to see. So there's that, and then there is a shared terminology and conceptual view. You see the words on the screen there: faith, Savior, God or Son of God, Lord, Gospel, and peace. We recognize all of those terms as Bible words. But every one of those terms was also used to describe the Roman emperor or what the Roman emperor had done. There is also the word Pantocrator that is used in the Bible. It is sometimes translated as Almighty. And there is a similar term that is used of the Roman emperor, Autocrator, the one who is self-powerful. And then there is this idea of exaltation to heaven. Jesus, of course, the Bible tells us, has gone to heaven where he reigns at the right hand of God. And the Romans told similar stories about deified emperors, how they had experienced an apotheosis. They had gone to be in the presence of the gods, and in Roman art, the deceased Roman emperors are depicted as in the company of the gods, seated there with the gods and crowned with glory. So some scholars have looked at these two phenomena. We've got this Roman presence everywhere, And then we've got the Christians using the very terminology that the Romans were using to describe their emperor and their beliefs. And so the argument kind of goes like this, that since the dominant nature of the Roman Empire was ubiquitous, and the New Testament authors used the same terminology that was used in the Roman imperial cult, does this mean that the early Christians presented Jesus and the gospel as kind of a counter-imperial narrative? Is the gospel meant to be an anti-imperial narrative? And that's kind of the jumping off place where this trend in New Testament scholarship begins. They say, well, look at what's going on. You've got the Christians who are just completely aware of what is going on in the government around them, and the Christians choose to use the same terms that the Romans are using. That would suggest that the Christians are presenting an alternate story, whereas the Romans speak of the emperor as God and Savior and Lord and all of that, the Christians are presenting Jesus that way. However, there is a bit of a problem. No New Testament text comes right out and says that we are, us Christians are in the business of supplanting the Roman emperor, or that this is the narrative that we want people to read rather than the Roman propaganda. And so, armed with such a perspective, practitioners of this approach have suggested that the New Testament contains hidden transcripts, and that's their terminology that is used in the literature. And these hidden transcripts are critical of Rome, and that a clued-in reader will discern them. And so, for example, whenever Paul mentions the Lord reigning, or, that kind of thing, practitioners of this type of approach would say, when you say that in the first century, everybody knows what you're talking about. You're saying that the emperor is not the Lord and that Jesus is rather the correct Lord. And so this approach to reading the New Testament has come to be called simply empire criticism. And one author has defined it this way: empire criticism examines how the biblical text engages with the presence of Rome, how the texts offer arguments for and against empire, and how Greco-Roman religion, and especially the imperial cult, could have influenced the biblical text. And let me just stop right there and say, that makes us bristle, right? But the fact is that the biblical authors lived in a cultural context, and they are using things that are from their day, so that's not necessarily a problem. Moreover, empire criticism also considers how the biblical authors may have responded to the Roman Empire, either positively or negatively. So empire criticism is this discipline in New Testament studies that says that the early Christians are basically reacting to the Roman presence, reacting to Roman power, that the gospel is designed to create an impression of Roman power and to critique it, and that all the early Christians know this. So let me just give you some samples of this from people who are actually doing this. Richard Horsley is a scholar whose name you may be familiar with. He's done a lot of New Testament work, and he is really one of the big proponents of empire criticism. So in one of his books, he says, focus on the Roman imperial order as the context of Paul's mission, however, is leading to another recognition. Instead of being opposed to Judaism, Paul's gospel of Christ was opposed to the Roman Empire. Paul set his gospel of Christ and the new communities he catalyzed in opposition to the Roman imperial order. N.T. Wright, some of you have heard of him. He takes this position as well. He says, when therefore Paul speaks of Jesus triumphant return in power to establish his sovereign rule over the world. And when he uses in relation to Jesus language, which was fairly common use for the return or appearance of Caesar, the present world ruler, we should draw the obvious conclusion. Paul's expectation of the day of the Lord included the expectation that on the last day, that which was already true would at last be revealed. Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. And if you have read the writings of N.T. Wright, some of you I know have, that's kind of a catchphrase that he has invented and become well known for. When the early Christians say Jesus is Lord, that means that Caesar is not. Another New Testament scholar who has advocated this approach in many of his writings is Warren Carter, and he says this: ambivalence of societal interaction, cooperation yet disguised critique, is evident in Jesus' difficult instruction about taxes. Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. And here's Carter's take on that. Jesus' instruction cleverly combines loyalty and deference with his own subversive agenda. He employs ambiguous, coded, and self-protective speech to uphold payment of a coin bearing the emperor's image, contrary to the Ten Commandments, while also asserting overriding loyalty to God. He balances apparent compliance with hidden resistance. And so that's how these guys would read texts like that. That when Jesus says, well, sure, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, that's only one part of what Jesus is saying, and that really Jesus is intending to say much more than just pay your taxes. He is saying that Rome is really an illegitimate empire. So is this a legitimate approach to the New Testament, and what should we make of it? Well, I think if we're going to be fair, the fact is that some people who heard the gospel in the first century said these very things. If you want to go to the book of Acts and look at chapter 16, this is when Paul is in Philippi. And remember, Paul has healed the little demon-possessed girl, and this causes a problem. And in verse 21, in verse 20, these men are throwing our city into confusion, being Jews. Yes, racism is much alive in the ancient world. And then verse 21, and they are proclaiming customs which is not lawful for us to accept or to observe, since we are Romans. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot of difficulty to figure out what they're talking about there. That Paul has been talking about allegiance to a king, Jesus. And these guys have put this kind of spin on it. Hey, these guys are talking about a king. And we are Romans. We've sworn an oath of loyalty to the emperor, and these guys are coming in here and talking about another king. In Acts chapter 17, and in verse 6, this is at Thessalonica. Remember, there is an uproar, and when the mob did not find Jason, they began, or the Christians, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, saying, these men who have upset the world have come here also, and Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And so there it is. These guys are teaching that there is another king who demands our loyalty. So is that really what the gospel sounded like? There's New Testament evidence that that's what people said about it. Well, let me suggest to you that this is political rhetoric that we're reading in Acts 16 and 17. And if you've ever watched a congressional hearing, or if you watch certain news channels, this is what you get, right? Political rhetoric. It's slanted. It's designed to create an impression. It's designed to make you think about something in a certain way. And that's what these people are doing. But there is no evidence in either one of these texts that the Roman authorities thought that this is what was going on. Nobody here in any position of power says that Paul is preaching a subversive message. It's the kind of thing you might say if you wanted to get Christians in trouble, but it's not the kind of thing that people seem to have thought about the gospel. So what I'd like to do in the time that we have is I'd like to present to you 12 responses to empire criticism and see what you think about them. So first of all, empire criticism is a contemporary reading of the New Testament, not a contextual one. It is a contemporary reading presenting itself as contextual. Now, those of you that know me and my approach to teaching, I'm all into context. And I firmly believe that we need to read these documents with the help of the context whenever possible. And we need to be students of the ancient texts and the ancient culture and all of that stuff. But for those who are not used to reading this kind of stuff, when you hear the statements that are made by empire critics, it sounds like, oh, that's the Roman context. That's what's going on in the first century. But it's not. It is an attempt to find a modern liberal political agenda in the New Testament, or at least import one into it. Michael Bird, some of you may have read some of his books. I think this is his book, An Anomalous Jew, says many of these so-called anti-imperial readings look suspiciously like coded critique of American foreign and economic policy under GOP presidents. You know where empire criticism started? It started in American universities during the presidency of George Bush. That's where this started. And it is a bunch of academics who have said, oh, that's not right. What he's doing is not right. And then they turn to the New Testament and say, Christianity was never, like this. That Christianity's always been anti-government. That's where all of this came from. It presents itself as contextual. And you'll get authors who write on these topics talking about Roman culture and Roman power, and it sounds very historical. But I would suggest to you that this is really not history. Let's look at a couple of the claims. Number 2, the use of similar terminology, which is what everybody agrees is going on here, does not prove borrowing, and it does not prove criticism either. In the quotation I showed you from N.T. Wright a moment ago, he mentions this, that the early Christians are using the same terms as the Romans, and so let's draw the obvious conclusion, he says. Well, it's not an obvious conclusion. Just because you and I use the same word once in a while doesn't mean we mean the same thing by it. We're talking about the same thing. And if I use the same word you're using, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm criticizing you. It's just that we're using the same words for things. The fact is that every one of the terms on that list that I showed you are in the Septuagint. That all of these words come from the Jewish heritage of Christianity. Lord, Savior, God, Son, peace, all of these things are found in the Bible that Paul and the early Christians were reading. And so to jump to the conclusion that the early Christians are using Roman imperial terminology, and that's the target, I think misses the point of what the early Christians are doing. The early Christians used the religious vocabulary that was available to them. They did not invent new words. They did not invent new concepts. And sure, the Romans were using these too, but the Jews had been using them. There is no borrowing going on here, nor is there any kind of criticism that can be proven from this. Thirdly, And this was pointed out in an article a couple years ago that I thought was just kind of the emperor's new clothes kind of argument. If criticisms of the Roman Empire are coded or hidden in the New Testament text, then how do we know that they're really there? The New Testament's full of secret criticisms of the Roman Empire. Really? And how do you know this? If they're secret, you shouldn't know that, right? So there's kind of a little thing going on here. Empire criticism assumes that the Roman Empire was what is called in modern times a surveillance state. That it's always listening. It's always checking on people to see if they are saying or doing things that are subversive. And so here's Paul. Now you have to remember, on the Roman radar screen, the Christians are a little blip over here in the corner. They're like a fly that the Romans think they just need to swat now and then. And Paul who? Right? That's what the Romans would say. Paul who? Never heard of Paul of Tarsus. Who's he? What does he do? You know, the Christians are not famous people. This is not the 3rd or 4th century where everybody knows what Christianity is. And yet we are supposed to believe that the Romans are reading Paul's letters and looking for any kind of criticism of the Roman Empire. Empire criticism further assumes that the New Testament documents were intentionally created with hidden codes. Like I said, if they're hidden, how do we know that they're there? And the argument in response has been, well, it's kind of like the German Enigma code. We know it's a code. Therefore, we have to break it. And so we know these documents were coded, and that's how everything works. And so the assumption is that the New Testament documents were intentionally created with these codes, and that all the early Christians openly knew and understood this. Give me a break, right? Paul writes this letter to the churches and the Christians in Rome. And when Paul wrote that letter, he had not been to there. He had never visited those people. And yet all of these people are supposed to know that this is a coded document. And we read it that way. It just doesn't fit. And empire criticism also requires some circular reasoning here. How do you know these are coded criticisms? Well, because they make perfect sense when you read them that way, right? No, that's not an argument. We're going to have something better than that for this to work. Fourthly, kind of going along with that, empire criticism assumes that Christianity has an inherent political interest in an agenda for the world. And that's just kind of the unstated assumption, that Christianity is supposed to be a political force. And the early Christians understood that and knew that. And if you ask these people, well, why don't they ever say that? You know, their answer is, well, it's just kind of understood. And that's the argument from silence, right? It's not there because they didn't need to say it. No, that's not how history works. It creates what some people have called a binary confusion. When you've got two things, it could be that both and is what's at work here. That the early Christians are saying we are giving our allegiance to Christ, and when we can, we give it to Caesar as well. That those two things are not opposites. But the empire critics take those two things and make them opposites. That we can either be under the reign of Jesus or the reign of Caesar, but we cannot do both. And that is a mistake in thinking as well. Number 5, and some of you are probably already thinking about this, what text in the New Testament is going to be the biggest problem for criticizing the Roman Empire? Romans 13. Be in subjection to the governing authorities. Pay your taxes. Be good citizens. Those things are ordained by God, Paul says. and if you resist the authority, you have resisted God. That's a pretty difficult text to get around, if you ask me. So how do the empire critics get around Romans chapter 13? Well, some of them say that it wasn't ever part of Romans. And again, circular reasoning, right? We're reading the New Testament as a critique of the Roman Empire. Romans 13 obviously doesn't fit, so Romans 13 must not have been part of what Paul wrote. Some say, well, no, we got to be honest. You know, all the manuscripts we've got have got Romans 13 in it. And so they would say, well, it's just too broad to be read at face value. Because these guys are convinced that Paul is criticizing the Roman Empire everywhere else in his writings. And so when Paul says something like this, be in subjection to the governing authorities, that something's up here. You know, Paul surely doesn't mean that. Paul surely can't be saying what it seems that he is saying. And so some like Neil Elliott claim that this is sarcastic on Paul's part. Oh yeah, obey the Roman government. I gotta say that. Everybody, you listening? Yeah, Romans reading my mail. I'm telling everybody to obey the government here. Or, if you read Romans, the first part of Romans and the sinfulness of the world, critics say, well, Paul's already said that everything that's not Jesus is part of the sinful humanity, and that the Roman government is just like that. And so they've got these little ways of dealing with Romans 13, but I think you and I would probably agree today that these are not obvious readings of Romans 13. Nowhere does Paul indicate to us, like he does in 2 Corinthians, that he's about to get sarcastic. Paul usually says, now, I'm going to say something really stupid here that I don't like to say, but it's the only way you Corinthians will ever listen to me, and so I'm going to brag. Paul doesn't do that here in Romans 13. As a matter of fact, Romans 13 makes perfect sense in the context. Paul has been talking about loving everybody. And that extends to not only other Christians, Romans 12, it extends not only to those who persecute us at the end of Romans 12, it extends to everybody, and that means that I subject myself to the governing authorities. There is nothing amiss with Romans 13. Number 6, Roman power was indeed everywhere. And again, I think sometimes these guys paint with a very broad brush. They want us to get this impression that Roman power is in your face 24/7. And that it was nothing but oppressive. And that's what the early Christians are dealing with. But I think a much more natural reading is that the early Christians viewed Roman power and Roman culture the same as they viewed any other idolatrous culture. That Rome is not especially bad, it's not especially good, it's just another pagan culture. It's not being singled out for criticism. The oppressive nature of Roman power is overstated by empire critics because they feel oppressed by American political policies, and they say, yeah, Paul saw that too, and he was reacting to all of that. Well, if you read the ancient literature, there are voices in the ancient literature that complain about Roman oppression. But the vast majority of people in the ancient world said, it's the way it is, and we live under this, right? I mean, if you were to press me, I might say, well, there's some things our government does that I really don't care for, but, it doesn't change the way I live my life. It doesn't have a really big effect on what I do. It's just the situation I live in, and I'm not opposed, to it in the way that these guys would suggest. The fact is that the kingdom of God relativizes all human authority. And that is the message of the gospel. And Clay talked about this in the opening lecture on Monday morning, that Jesus has been enthroned as king. That is the gospel message. He is the King of kings and Lord of lords. And the gospel is a threat to any government that oversteps its authority. It is a threat to Rome when it oversteps its authority. It is a threat to the United States of America when our government oversteps its authority, because that's the way the gospel is. But it's not targeting the Roman Empire. John Barclay, a British scholar, one of my favorite reads, has said this: Paul's gospel is subversive of Roman imperial claims precisely by not opposing them with their own terms, but by reducing Rome's agency and historical significance to just one more entity in a much greater drama. You'll notice that Paul never mentions Rome in his writings. And it's kind of interesting. Just as the Romans would have looked at Paul as a blip on a radar screen, Paul looked at Rome as a blip on the radar screen as well. Not even worth mentioning specifically. And so this idea that the early Christians are they feel the weight of Roman oppression, and the gospel gives them this freedom from Roman power, and that's what's on their minds all the time. No, I don't think so. I think Paul would say, you can call it what you want. You can call it Babylon. You can call it Persia. You can call it Rome. You can call it the United States. You can call it the United Kingdom. I don't care. Any kingdom is relativized by the gospel of Jesus Christ. Number 7, Paul never mentioned the Roman imperial cult, nor did he ever offer any specific critique of the Roman Empire. And I think that's significant because we would expect somewhere for Paul to say something if this is his goal. Some people might say, well, what about the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2? That could be a reference to the Roman imperial cult. I'm not convinced that it is, and I would simply make the point today that it is not crystal clear that the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2 is the Roman emperor. And again, it's just not clear. Paul is not just jumping off the page here and saying, this is what I'm talking about. Number 8, the empire that Jesus aimed to destroy was Satan's kingdom of sin and death. That's the rival kingdom that Paul is interested in. And I think this is interesting because I think that's what the early Christians are preaching. And I think that when they go into towns and preach the gospel, that's what people hear. That they understood that Paul was talking about the defeat of Satan. And imagine 2,000 years ago, you're living in the Roman Empire, and somebody comes into your town and says, I want to talk to you about a dead Jewish king who has defeated Satan. Does that sound like a threat to the Roman Empire to you? No. And I think everybody knew that Paul wasn't talking about politics. I think that the primacy of this message is what kept the Romans from opposing the gospel. I mean, if the Romans had ever caught on to the idea that Paul was openly criticizing the gospel in these codes that he's writing to all these churches, there is no doubt what they would have done. They would have closed it down immediately. They would have rounded up all the Christians, killed them, put Paul to death, and said, this stops now. And the reason we know that is because when other groups formed in the Roman Empire and got subversive, this is exactly what the Romans did to them. They said, no, you are not allowed to get together and talk about politics. But I think it's a testimony to the fact that the Romans weren't talking about politics, that Christianity kept spreading. Because people knew that that's not what the Christians are talking about. They're talking about some Jewish guy over in Palestine who they say is a king and defeating Satan. It's okay, you can say that. but it's not subversive. Now, what's interesting is that if you read the writings of the Apostle John, and especially the book of Revelation, and no, we're not going to get into that debate today. I'm going to tell you what it means, and you're going to have that. Okay? So, the book of Revelation, I believe, is written about the imperial cult. And John says, yeah, it's the enemy. It is the beast from the land, comes up out of the land. So how do we go from this message that is not anti-imperial to John's writings? Well, because things had changed by the end of the first century. When the imperial cult is forced upon Christians and the Roman government is overstepping its authority, then John says, yeah, now they're the enemy. But in Paul's day, that's not what's going on. And in Paul's letters, there is no hint that Paul sees the Roman Empire as the enemy. The enemy is Satan and his kingdom of sin and death. That's what Jesus came to destroy. That's what people need to rebel against. Number 9. No New Testament author called for Christians to engage in political resistance, political activism, or anything like that. The question is raised, could you even do that in the Roman Empire? And the answer is basically no. I mean, you could do it once. But if this were such a burning issue, we would expect the early Christians to be saying something like, we need to find a way to let our voice be heard. Or we need to form this countercultural movement. But none of them do that. And I get sometimes asked by young people, should Christians be politically active? Should we be political activists for proper causes? And my answer is, you can do that if you want to, but that's not what Christianity demands of you. No New Testament author ever said that we ought to go out and protest or demonstrate or write letters to congressmen or things like that to get the government to change. That's not what Christianity is here to do. Nothing suggests that the early Christians thought of themselves as political revolutionaries, social justice champions, or any such things. As a matter of fact, they were content to live under the system that they had. And that brings us to number 10. Paul used the benefits of his Roman citizenship when he thought it was advantageous. You remember in Acts chapter 16, after he has been beaten up and thrown in prison in Philippi, they come the next morning and say, Paul's probably learned his lesson, we'll let him go and we'll never see him again. And so they tell Paul and Silas, get up and go, you can leave town now. And Paul says, I ain't going nowhere because you have beaten a Roman citizen and I want justice. And in Acts 25, the new governor comes to Palestine trying to make friends with the Jews. And they say, hey, you've got a prisoner that your predecessor took from us, Paul. We would like to try him in our court, and it would be, really a good thing for us to get off on the right foot if you'd give our prisoner back to us. And the Roman governor says, yeah, I think I might do that. What does Paul do? I appeal to Caesar, right? I'm going to do this. I have the right to be heard in Rome, and I'm going to get out of here. So was Paul compromising his values when he did that? Was he playing with the enemy when he did that? No. There is no indication that Paul has now somehow compromised his anti-Roman stance. Paul understood that these things could be advantageous to him in some cases and was willing to do so. Number 11, Paul urged Christians to live in a way that outsiders would find respectable. And so passages like 1 Thessalonians 4, Colossians 4, lots of passages where Paul says, live a quiet life. Make sure that those who are outside do not have any reason to blaspheme the name of Jesus Christ. Be good people. Fit in with the city where you live as much as you can. Obey the laws. Be a good citizen. Paul said, I don't want the church to have the reputation of being a bunch of misfits and troublemakers. You be good people. There is no sense in Paul's letters that Rome or the subjects of Rome are the enemy, and that we don't care what they think, and as a matter of fact, they can just all just go away. No, Paul says we live around these people, and we should do our best to be respectable among them. Se-Yoon Kim has said that nowhere in his epistles does Paul suggest that doing the duties of the citizens of God's kingdom involves fighting a human kingdom. Just doesn't happen. And then finally, this morning, number 12, if this is the right way to read Paul's letters, and everybody in the first century knew that, then we would expect that the post-apostolic period would reflect this. That the Christians who lived in the second and third centuries would have been talking about this. That, we all know that when Paul writes, he's writing against the Roman Empire, and the discussions that they have with the pagans and the writings that they leave behind, we would expect this to come up. But the fact is that there is no anti-imperial interpretation of Paul's letters circulating in the post-apostolic period. They don't know that this is what Paul is really talking about. And if empire criticism were the correct reading of Paul, we would have expected these Christians to have known it. But they didn't. And so I've tried to sound a warning here today that this is a trend in New Testament studies that sounds like context, but really isn't. And we need to be very careful students of our Bibles and of history to be able to see what the context is and what it isn't. That's what I have for today. Thank you for your kind attention.